Good evening, our fellow Americans. Welcome to the Leadership Podcast. I'm your host this evening, Brett Miller. I'm here with my co-host tonight, Dion Dixon and Will Atkins. Unfortunately, Thea is not able to join us this evening, but we're going to be jumping into the topic tonight of tariffs, right? And obviously, we have these discussions so that our disagreements can fuel your decisions. We want to be able to make sure that you guys can think through information that's posted out there, because we know the world gets a little crazy, right? There's a lot of voices that are out there, some good, some bad, some crazy, some not, but it's, kind of tough sorting through them all. And so we just want to give you a place that you can come and listen to and have some knowledge, and hopefully we can share our conversations in a civil manner that can give you, again, that information that our disagreements can form your decisions. So with that in mind, like I said, we're going to be talking tariffs tonight. That's all tied around government income and where that kind of plays into the economics of the country and forces down to the economics of the people. But Will, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to you to get us kind of kicked off on that.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. So basically, for those that aren't tracking, tariffs are taxes on imported goods. And at the time of this recording, what we're seeing is a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum coming in from all countries. So that's a 25% tax on the import of steel and aluminum, 25% across the board on anything from Canada and Mexico, and an additional 20% on top of an existing 10% on China. We are seeing some threats of 200% on European liquor. And we should note that Canada and China have retaliated with their own tariffs. Mexico and the EU have threatened retaliatory tariffs, but we haven't seen them do it yet. And, all of this, none of this should come as a surprise. Historically, I mean, we've been here before. We've done this. Smoot-Hawley in the 1930s. Ultimately, when we impose some tariffs on certain things, and there's pros and cons to that, other countries will retaliate with their own tariffs on the things that we're trying to export into their countries. So I imagine as we go through the discussion, we'll talk about the pros and cons of it. But like I said, we've been here before, and I am a firm believer that the cons outweigh the pros on implementing tariffs.
Well, why is that?
Because they don't work.
Okay. Can you expand upon that?
There, like I said, there are pros and cons, right? There is an argument to be made that some of the hollowing out of our Rust Belt states was due to NAFTA free trade agreements that ended up not working as well in our favor. And that is some of the cons to free trade. But the cons of tariffs, if we see this retaliatory tariff and then we raise ours or threaten to raise ours, all it does is disrupt global trade, and I think we're already starting to see that. I mean, the American stock market has tanked. I think we're seeing some of those negatives already start to come to fruition.
So in the research, and I think you guys have seen this, what I pulled up is one of the things that sort of helps the United States use tariffs as a negotiating tool is that there is a trade openness ratio, which is basically how much you import versus how much you rely domestically. And we actually have an openness ratio of 28%, which means that the other 72% of our economy is essentially reliant on domestic goods and services. And so what that does for us is that does allow us to sort of use the tariffs more as a trade weapon on the global stage than other countries might be able to do. So some examples are like Germany and the UK, their trade openness ratio is actually flipped. So they're in the 70 to 80% range, where very little of their economy is reliant on domestic production. And so they would have a hard time using tariffs because if they get faced with retaliatory tariffs, then that actually has a huge impact on them. Whereas in the short term, the United States can sort of ride out those retaliatory tariffs because of our large domestic production base.
So I think it's important to note there, though, that the 22% or whatever it is, or the 28%, it depends on what those products are rather than just the, when you take a holistic view of all trade, if the 28% that we're relying on externally are, I don't know, semiconductors, then, even though that's only one product or one area that we are reliant on importing from other countries, if that is such a center of gravity of our economy, then it doesn't. Do you know what I'm saying? Like if we really need that 28% and it's going to crash everything else, then it doesn't matter how internally reliant we are.
Yeah, agreed. And I thought Biden was supposed to fix that with the CHIPS Act, right? Wasn't that supposed to bring back?
Right.
Yeah. So, and that I think brings up one of the pros of it, and hopefully we will get through a lot of these pros and cons. But one of the pros of tariffs is that what you can do is you can make it more expensive for the American consumer to buy imported goods, and therefore make it more attractive for the American consumer to buy domestic products, right? And so a prime example prior to NAFTA was that you could pretty much always get a Ford or a Chevy far cheaper than the equivalent Honda or BMW or whatever, right? And that was largely due to the fact that we had tariffs on those imports, and we were trying to favor a domestic production. Of course, as you mentioned before, NAFTA kind of threw that balance out of whack. But that's one of the pros to tariffs and using them wisely. What about you, Brett? What say you?
I mean, overall, I think, again, it's a pros and cons, right? Everything has them. Whether you're looking at the tariffs side of things or any other revenue generating method that the government uses. But when we're looking at just at tariffs, at least in the recent days, how I've seen them used, they seem to be more of a negotiating tool, a strategic prod, I guess, than necessarily a long-term plan. That's just kind of what I'm seeing now. I'm not an economist, so I don't know all the ins and outs when it comes to that stuff, but I think there is value in using them as a negotiation tool. And I think if they are used strategically in that sense to where we can target the areas that we need to target to foster growth in the American economy to kind of backfill those areas, I think that's a valuable thing. Now, if we're looking at blanket statements, again, the whole concept of central planning, one size fits all, I think it's a terrible idea. I think we're going to end up really hurting not only our own economy, but the world economy by doing so. To Will's point, he's kind of said, like, we've already started to see that. Now, I won't say that the stock market is a good indicator of that, because in all honesty, the stock market, it's kind of like a thermometer in a room, right? It reacts to what's happening around it. And it's a fear indicator most of the time. Anytime there is change, most people don't like change. So the immediate thing is the fear response. So I don't know if that's necessarily the way to go, in terms of looking at that as the proper indicator, right? Is to see as whether this is a good idea. I think this, using tariffs is a long-term plan. I don't think we're going to see an immediate stabilization. I don't know. My mind goes to the engineering route. When you look at a spring constant, right? You see the sine wave that comes from that. You have the initial spike where it goes up high and drops low, and then eventually it kind of levels itself out over time. I think that's what we're going to see from this. Now, again, I'm not an expert in that, but that's just kind of the gut feeling I get from it. I think it's being used as a negotiation tool initially to kind of show that, no, we do have leverage, Dean, like you're saying, to the fact that, hey, we can survive this longer than you can. So let's play this game and see kind of I don't know, it's a game of chicken, so to speak.
But what are they negotiating, being used as a negotiation tool for what? It seems to me that it was just because I don't think anyone would argue. Sure, it would be wonderful if we produced everything that the U.S. needs in house and we never have to rely on another country. It's just not realistic in my mind.
I actually don't think it's a good idea. I think it's terrible that if we try to do everything ourselves.
Then what are we trying to use tariffs as a negotiation tool to do what? Like just to punish Canada and Mexico because we don't like them?
I mean, I don't think we're looking to punish them from that regards. I think looking historically, we have been treated kind of unfairly when it comes to the trade game, because a lot of people think, oh, Americans, the big guy, they've got the most amount of money. They can afford to do this sort of stuff. And yeah, for a time that may play, but eventually that doesn't work. And it's supposed to not just be free trade. It's supposed to be fair trade. Like there's supposed to be a balance that kind of comes into it. And when you've been untreated fairly long enough, you kind of get over it, right? You're like, all right, I'm done with this. We're going to change the game.
So, I mean, my question still stands. What is it that we want Canada and Mexico to do? I mean, NAFTA created free trade, didn't create it, but NAFTA enshrined some free trade such that it became cheaper, that manufacturers exported their factories essentially overseas, where the labor was cheaper, and then they could just ship the product back in. What is it that we're asking Canada and Mexico to do?
From my perspective, as the third party kind of looking at all of this, honestly, I think that Donald Trump has a hammer and he sees all of his problems as nails. And so he has this tariff power, which I would like us to talk a little bit about this, because in my research, I had heard people on TV talk about how, the president, has this tariff power. And I started looking into it and I was like, well, that's actually not in the Constitution. The Constitution actually says that Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, of which a tariff is a type.
Yes.
And it was actually a law passed by Congress that gave the president some import tariff power. But anyways, like I think now that Trump has this power that he can somewhat wield unilaterally, he's like, aha, here's my tool, and now I'm going to tackle every problem with it if I can.
Well, from what I've seen, at least recently, the way that it... Sorry, go ahead, Will.
I just was saying, so again, what's the problem? What is it that he wants Canada to do?
Well, this is what I was going to say. Like, from what I'm seeing from the news reports that I read and the information that I've gathered, it doesn't seem like it's being used as an economic driver and per se of like, we want them to respond economically to things. We're using it more of as a, hey, if you don't do the things we want, we're going to hurt you economically. And it seems that the biggest push has been border security, from both those countries. Now, I don't know if that's the end game. That's the narrative that seems to be pushed, right? Again, I'm not on the inside of this. I don't know for sure. But from the outside looking in, that seems to be the game they're trying to play, is that they want the stop of, fentanyl and illegal drugs and illegal immigrants coming into the country. They want to put a hold on it. And so they want, both our North and South partners to actually put in some of the effort on their own to help secure these borders. That seems to be what they're looking to do right now. I think there's some other long-term benefits that will come with it. But again, that's yet to be seen.
I think that makes sense on the southern border. Where Canada comes in, though, this is what confused me. And this is where I think it's maybe a little bit more of a personal grief that Trump had with Trudeau. Because from the latest reports that I saw, it was a small single-digit percentage of fentanyl was coming in from the northern border, and the same thing with illegal immigration from the northern border. So those two things make all the sense in the world for Mexico, but for Canada, that's where I go. It's not an economic thing. It's not like a border security thing. So what is it?
And I tend to agree. I give that argument more weight on the southern border. Not that we have heard the administration actually come out and say, as soon as Mexico tightens up the border, we'll lay off these tariffs, that sort of thing. They seem to just be relatively indiscriminate and for no reason other than he feels like doing them. But that argument doesn't make a lot of sense for the northern border. It seems more like we want you to become the 51st state. I have an issue. Yes, I have an issue with Trudeau, because that's, again, like, what do you want Canada to do? Like, it's maple syrup, like, so I don't know. There are pros and cons to using tariffs to do certain things. If you're using it to try to protect, so as an example, like the aluminum industry in the United States, right? If you're using it in those ways, like, there are pros to doing that, but then the con is the higher costs that the consumer is just going to have to pay. The consumers are the ones that are going to pay that 20-25% tariff.
Unless there's a domestic product that comes in at the untariffed rate.
Yes. And so if you're going to use it in order to incentivize building up that industry in your own country, there will be, Dion, to your point about the CHIPS Act. We can't create chip factories overnight, right? But if you're going to use it to incentivize creating that industry in your own country, then yeah, at some point you'll now have the ability to have it produced domestically and you don't have to pay the tariff. I think that we might be surprised to see that even if we start producing it in-house, once people get used to paying that 25% more, then corporations are just going to continue to charge that amount, even though their supply costs go down. I think we've kind of seen that over the last couple of years with everything.
Yeah. So I want to go back to this law that Congress passed, and I also want to talk about why Congress isn't not only why isn't Congress stepping in now, because I think just the current politics will explain that, but why Congress hasn't stepped in over the past 60 years, because the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, Section 232, is what gave some of the tariff power to the president. And it allows the president to impose import restrictions based on an investigation and affirmative determination by the Department of Commerce that certain imports threaten to impair U.S. national security. And to me, that seems very limited in scope. And yet, when you're talking about, say, Trump was threatening a 200% tariff on European wine and spirits, which, by the way, would really upset me because I love a single malt Scotch. And it's already a very expensive liquor. I don't want to pay 200% more. But that hardly seems like a national security issue, right? So, like, I would think that either Congress or the courts would step up for any president that has used these tariffs in the past and be like, hey, where is your investigation from the Department of Commerce? Where's their report that says this is a national security issue? And if it doesn't exist, then yeah, stop.
No, it's an excellent question, Dion. So I don't really have an answer for it. It makes you wonder if it's just they're not wanting to exercise that power or if there's a reason behind it. I honestly have no idea.
But it's because it's Trump. That's why Congress doesn't want to.
Well, yeah, I think we know why now, right? Trump definitely has that personality, and he has a majority in both houses of Congress. So politically, it makes sense why they're not raising a stink right now. But this act went into law in 1962, and I know we've had presidents who have put tariffs on things that definitely were not national security related in the past 60 years.
What I was just trying to find a comparison of which presidents implemented which tariffs over time, and it's, from what I've seen, the use of tariffs by presidents previously were very targeted, narrow, to protect the U.S. steel industry, not 25% across the board from Canada because I don't like Canada. We're not trying to protect the maple syrup industry of Vermont and New Hampshire. So it just seems like Congress doesn't want to push back against Trump because he's Trump. And I don't think previously, I don't think Congress pushed back because it wasn't as sweeping. If George W. Bush is putting a tariff on steel to protect the steel industry, I think Congress is like, okay, that's fine.
Or maybe the juice isn't worth the squeeze. Like even when it gets a little bit squirrely and they're like, I'm not really sure how that, how that relates to national security, because I want to say it was during Trump's first term that he imposed a 30% tariff on whiskeys from Europe. Because I do remember my price of scotch going up during his first term, and I was really angry about that. And I think it was a Democrat majority Congress then, and they didn't raise a stink about that not being a national security issue. So I wonder if it's just one of those things where they're like, we've got far bigger fish to fry. We're not going to go after you just used this law to do something that wasn't intended for.
Well, and when you're talking about scotch or something, yeah, that's one thing. But, when we're talking about trying to protect the steel industry, I think what congressperson's going to get out there and be like, I don't want to protect the U.S. steel industry, get rid of this tariff, right? Politically, it would not be advantageous for them to do that. But also, a narrowly focused tariff like that isn't going to have the same kind of repercussions on global trade that, 25% on Canada and Mexico is going to have.
Now, if you look at the history of the United States, it wasn't until 1913 that we ratified the amendment that made income tax a thing in this country. And aside from very short stints, usually right after a war, where they would invoke an income tax on the richest Americans to basically recoup some revenue to pay for the war, largely the United States relied on tariffs to fund the government. And so I think a lot of Republicans right now, especially, will say, hey, why don't we do this, right? Why don't we go back to that system? So, that's maybe a good question for us to answer for our viewers and listeners. Why shouldn't we? Or maybe why should we, right?
Yeah. So before the income tax, tariffs were about half of our revenue. And it's tough to apply that to present day, though, because after we got rid of the tariffs, because we could fund the government with income tax, our economy took off. And it's hard. You can't pinpoint that just on getting rid of tariffs. I mean, after the world wars, because of, and then after the world wars, our economy took off. I don't know that you can put that at the feet of getting rid of tariffs, but we also didn't have that much. I know you're going to love this, Dion. We didn't have that much of a government to fund anyway. So yes, when half of our revenue comes from tariffs, but we didn't need that much to fund the government anyway, then, do
you think there's a correlation that's there, that because we had income tax, there was more revenue for the government? So the government's like, oh, we can get bigger now.
Probably. Yeah. But the way that we are now today, you cannot fund the government on tariffs.
Well, not fully, or unless you
gets
shrink
to
the
do
government.
Everything they want to do, we could.
Wait till Doge gets done with us. That's touche.
I just got finished filing my taxes for this year, and my effective income tax was 24%. That's a lot. Like if you do the math, that means that essentially 3 months out of my year, I worked solely for the government. Right. And only 9 months of that was to pay for my house and feed my family and all that stuff. And that
Well, but that was
seems
3 months for the federal government, let alone sales
well,
tax
no.
and
So
property
that's
tax and
including
everything
my
else.
5% or so for the state. Yeah. So it's that 24% is both. So it was about 19% for the federal government and then another 5 or so for the state. But yeah, about for government as a whole, I worked about, a quarter of my year solely for them. I wonder if we could completely get rid of income tax and then go to a 100% tariff system. Not 100% tariffs, but that our system of revenue is 100% based on tariffs, right? I wonder if that could work because 25%, 24% of my income is a lot. Like,
I think people have looked at that though, and like mathematically, it cannot fund the government as we know it today. So to your point, let's see what happens after Doge gets done with it, right? But I take a little bit of issue with, when you say, well, I worked 3 months purely for the federal government, some amount of that is coming back to you, right? Like your roads, your fire department. Like it's not like you're working for 3 months and getting nothing in return. It's just dispersed so much that it's hard to quantify how much of your 3 months is actually going to come back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the point when you start looking at where that comes from. I don't know, taxation is such a slippery slope. You look at since 1913, the amount of taxes that we have excised on the people. I mean, I don't remember the exact number, but if you count them all up, it's close to 100 different taxes that have been put into existence that weren't before. And we were a prosperous nation beforehand. And it's hard to say. I mean, we're talking, 100 years into the future. It's a different economy. It's a different world. It's air travel, everything else has happened since then that's made the world smaller in a sense, so you can't do an apples to apples comparison with that. It's just not possible, right? I understand that. But at the same time, I don't know, I think inherently one of the things we're going to come across with all of these conversations, right, is for the most part, the left answer is going to be the government needs more to do more for us. And the right-ish answer is going to be more along the lines of the people can choose better for themselves. Let's put the power in the hands of the people. The answer is always going to be to some degree of that answer, right? Not always, not 100%, but majority of the time, that's kind of where we're going to go. And so I think in this instance, whereas if we can put more money back in the hands of people that they can make choices with their money, that's ultimately what it comes down to. Whether tariffs are the answer to that, whether a different form of income tax or we switch to a sales tax or something else, I don't know. But I think putting more money in the hands of people is going to result in them making better choices for themselves.
I mean, I take your point if we used it to get rid of income tax, but solely putting tariffs on is going to take money out of people's pockets. Like
again, depending on what they buy.
Today, the cost of items are going to go up, and it's going to take more money out of people's pockets.
No, I think like right now, given the situation on the ground that we have today, and we are recording this podcast on the 23rd of March. So with listeners and viewers, take that with a grain of salt, because who knows what's going to change tomorrow. But the situation on the ground today, so let's take, we already had a 10% tariff on Chinese imports, and Trump recently tacked on another 20%, right? Well, as Will alluded to, we don't really have domestic silicon production, right? So if you're in the market for a new iPhone in the next couple of months, once this current batch that people have in stores has been sold, and they need to order more from overseas. Well, those are going to get more expensive, right? And what's probably going to happen is these retailers don't want to lose customers, so they're not going to arbitrarily raise the prices on these phones. They're not going to say, "Oh, yeah, you could have gotten an iPhone 16 yesterday for this price, but it's $200 more today." They're not going to do that. But when the iPhone 17 comes out, I'm not an iPhone guy. Is that what number we're on?
I think that is what we're on. No idea. That's close.
Okay. I'm an Android guy, but when the iPhone 17 comes out, it's going to be that much more expensive than we've seen has been the trend, right? And so without having that domestic silicon production where we can go, hey, yeah, it's 30% tariff on these Chinese products that are coming in, but we have this manufacturer here in the United States that is making chips that are just as good, and they're 30% cheaper, guys.
And
we don't have that right now.
Right. And it'll be a while before we do, if ever. And you're right. I mean, they're not going to arbitrarily, or they're not going to raise it, 25% from one day to the next. I did see reports that some of the items that have the tariffs, even though we haven't sold out of what we already had, they're already starting to raise their prices. The companies are going to try to make it a more steady rise than a big jump all at once. I know I wasn't planning on getting a car quite as quickly as I am now, but I have to hurry up and go buy a car before cars go up 20%.
My parents actually went out and bought a car to replace their oldest one for that very same reason, because they saw the writing on the wall and they were like, we don't want to pay extra for it arbitrarily.
Yeah. And it's, because, and that gets back to kind of our opening salvo about how much of our economy is domestically produced. If key areas are purely imported, even though it's not many or it's not much of our economy, if it's key, then that's going to hurt.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to my statement before, Will, that I don't like the idea of us being solely dependent on America, because just that one example, right? Silicon production. Now, is that something that we could do here in the U.S.? I actually don't know. I don't know our geological survey enough to know if that's something we could produce. But the fact that we rely on the rest of the world, this is stuff that we have to take into consideration with this. And that's why you kind of mentioned before, like with the tariffs, I don't think a blanket tariff on all things is the right way to go. I think strategically using it to bolster certain American manufacturing is a good idea, but it shouldn't be used as a one-size-fits-all solution. Now, there's other things that come along with that too. I mean, we've seen the rare earth deals that are kind of being pushed around with Ukraine, and what was the other country that just came? Was it Egypt? There was another country that basically said, hey, we'll give you a rare earth deal
to the U.S.
I see that. I think it was Egypt. I'm not 100% on that. But yeah, it's like there are people that are willing to wheel and deal through this stuff, right? And so now it's a matter of how do we tackle that stuff, and that could maybe solve some of our problems that way too. Because again, I think it all really kind of comes down to it. What is the purpose of the tariffs? What are we doing this for? If it's for the economic strength of the country, if we're looking, is it a means to fund the U.S.? Okay, is that the only way we can do it? Are we using it as a cudgel, so to speak, to say, hey, you better do these things that we want you to do, otherwise we're going to hurt you economically? That's a possibility too, but that doesn't really affect, again, American manufacturing and the economy from that standpoint. It affects the money of the people. So there's so many moving pieces that come into this. And I think this is where the confusion comes from the general populace, is they just don't understand why this is happening or how it affects them. All they see is, I'm going to be spending more money.
And that's, that was what I was trying to say with there are pros and cons to tariffs. And if the administration were to come out and lay out exactly why they're doing it, on which industries, for what end goal, I think it would be much more palatable for people. Like when we were in World War II and we are rationing and we are like paying higher prices, but it's for the war effort, then people are amenable to doing that. But if it's because Trump doesn't like Trudeau, no one's gonna appreciate that.
There was one thing, Brett, what you were talking about kind of triggered something in my mind, which is we've been talking about tariffs as either hurting imports coming in or protecting American production. But there's a third thing there too, which is that and when you mentioned Ukraine and others, these deals for rare earth metals, we know that China, one, has vast expanses of earth that they are willing to mine in inhumane conditions to get rare earth metals that are needed for electronics and batteries and things like that. And so they have become one of the world's largest exporters of rare earth metals and minerals that are needed for all of our digital lives. But we also, as a country, we have a significant issue with their government, the way that they treat their people, their humanitarian record and stuff. And so kind of a third option with these tariffs is we can deliberately tariff a specific country like China and say, okay, we're going to make Chinese products more expensive. But hey, look over here, we can trade with, let's say it's Egypt, right? We don't have as many problems with them, so we're not going to tariff the exact same goods that they're importing to the United States, and therefore it sends trade to somebody who's more politically aligned with us. Maybe it sends trade to our allies, and maybe it helps to strengthen those bonds between us and those other countries. So that's another way that tariffs could be used, a positive way that they could be used that doesn't necessarily have to do directly with American production.
So, and by the way, it was the Congo. That's the country that
DR Congo, yeah. So the difference with that, though, Dion, is that we're putting tariffs on, in this example, China, because we don't like, one, we're in competition with them, but two, we don't like how they're doing it and everything else. But we find another outlet for that product to come into the States without the increase in cost. So that it's still, we get what we need in the rare earths, and it doesn't cost the American consumer anything more than what they were already spending.
Yeah, and I think there's value to that. I mean, one of the things you were saying, Will, that it would make it more palatable to people. I agree, but that also means that people are consuming the information that they need to actually understand that, which we've talked about before. Most people don't spend the time with that. They're busy with their lives, right? And then, of course, you've got the American media that you've got to get past for their spin cycle to get accurate information out to people. We both know that they haven't done a great job with that, no matter what side the information's coming from. So,
and yeah, I mean, yes, in all reality, people are just going to see the increased cost and not care why, or if there's a specific reason for it. They're just going to blame someone for it. Like, I think right now eggs are still Biden's fault. Right. So
see, like, yes, I can't remember if I mentioned that before, but I solved that problem, right? Like the whole bird flu thing. We just need to get them little masks. Everybody be all right.
Yeah. And vaccines, right?
Absolutely.
Let's get all the chickens.
It's not the topic of this podcast.
But yeah, I know people have commented that egg prices are starting to come down, at least here locally. They're not. You can get a case of eggs. I think it's, 7 dozen or something like that. And it was $32. Today I checked, it's $35, right? So it's gone up, even here just in the last 2 weeks, it's gone up an extra $3. Yeah, it's something like $5 something a dozen. It's ridiculous. So
I paid $8 for a dozen the other day when I went out grocery shopping.
Well, that's because you live in a much more metro area. I live in rural Ohio. We're not as bad.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, there are pros and cons to tariffs. And I don't want to make it sound like all tariffs are bad. I do, Brett, I take your point that we wouldn't want to be necessarily 100% reliant on the US. It's nice to have a bunch of different options. But I think ultimately we're shooting ourselves in the foot here. All we're doing is pissing off our biggest trading partners who, yes, to your point, they are less able to withstand retaliatory tariffs, but what it's doing is just forcing them to go find other trade deals. Like we're not the end all be all. It's easy and probably cheapest to trade with the United States for Mexico and Canada, but that doesn't mean that they can't find other outlets or import from somewhere else. And I do feel like we're just, like I said, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot. They'll just go find customers somewhere else.
Yeah, and that's where I just think there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle that it's almost kind of like putting it together upside down, right? You don't really know what colors are there. You're just going by what you can sort of feel out. And there's a lot of things here that I think the average person doesn't understand. I know I don't, right? And I think when it comes to politics, I'm probably above average, but I'm nowhere near an expert in this stuff. And so I think that trying to solve this, obviously we talk on here, like we're not offering, full blown solutions to people. We just want to get people to think differently and approach it so that they can at least, run thoughts through a couple of brain cells so they can at least come up with some ideas on their own. They're not just parroting information back from what they hear out there. And that's what I want people here to do, is that I just want them to start thinking about stuff and realizing that there may be more to it than that. And maybe it's worth investigating from that standpoint. Find out why these are here, because then once you know that, you can voice those opinions to your government, like we've all talked about, right? Go up the chain, go from local and work its way up, but let people know how you feel about stuff. And if you don't agree with it, explain why. But that's got to be the thing too. You can't just be like, well, I just feel this way. Okay, well, I'm sorry you feel that way, but what's the logic behind it? What's your actual reasoning? Have a coherent thought that goes behind it to explain why you believe the things you believe. And so
it's a high bar though, and we mentioned it earlier in this episode that, I would argue for like 90% plus of everyday Americans, they're just going to see the higher price as they try to buy whatever product it is. They don't have the time or the desire to go research, trade law and tariffs to figure out why this cost is going up. And as much as I'm okay with Trump shooting himself in the foot, metaphorically, of course, I don't feel like this is a long-term, like this is going to be a win for him. And again, unless I don't give him a lot of credit. I've said it before, unless he's playing 3D chess that no one else knows about, like what is the objective here? I just don't see it. And as prices start to go up, I think people and his base are just going to turn on him because they just see the higher cost of goods.
Yeah, I agree with that. The economy is something that if it's not addressed and corrected, there's a lot of people that are going to change their opinion quickly. Because like you said, most people vote with their wallets. It's kind of where it comes from. It's a necessity of life.
I think we saw in 2024, it was a big repeat of, 1992, where, a lot of people, especially after the fact, were saying it's the economy, stupid. And that was one of the things that Trump ran on was, he said, hey, this Biden guy ran the economy into the ground. I'm going to fix that. Coming in your first 100 days and making everything more expensive is probably not the best way to do that, unless you've got a long-term strategy that overall it starts to bring stuff down. I haven't seen that. I don't know that there's a long-term strategy there. So as a libertarian, I would say that I would be fine with these tariffs if they came with a reciprocal reduction in other taxes that I had to pay, because now all that's happening is everything in my life is just getting more expensive, and it ultimately is putting more dollars into the pockets of the federal government, which does not always do with my money what I would like to see them do.
So it seems like, Dion, I mean, when we talk about tariffs as being a tax on imported goods, and libertarians don't like tax, right? So
but the tariff, like at the time of taxation, the tariff is paid by the other country. Right now, if that country is smart, they will increase the prices of their goods so that when I buy it, they recoup the money that they paid. But it is technically at point of sale. It is initially a tax paid by somebody else, not by Americans. So I think libertarians would be all on board with that. Again, if it was not combined with the existing income tax that we have.
Yeah. And to that point, I mean, you're right. As a libertarian, then you could choose to not buy that product that is now 25% more expensive, theoretically, right? You may not have a choice. So at least then you have some agency in whether or not you pay that tax or not versus the income tax that you don't have a lot of say in.
I think I have no say in it. I think my choices are to pay it or go to jail.
Or you could not work and not have the income. I mean, that's as much of an option as like not buying a car, like we don't have walkable cities or mass transit.
But I need my single malt scotch, and therefore I need the income to pay for it.
Could always become a moonshiner, Dion.
And then you won't. Then you'll choose to buy that scotch. Like
I said, Dion, you could always become a moonshiner. Just make your own.
Oh man, but so my rule of thumb is that a single malt scotch should be old enough to drink itself. And if I start now, that means I have to wait 21 years to have my first sip of my own moonshine. I don't think I can wait that long.
Just make others along with it. You'll be all right, So before we start to wrap it up, I do, when I opened, I said, we've been here before. We did Smoot Hawley. It made the depression worse. Over under on whether or not this causes recession. I'm a pessimist in general, and I'm obviously not a fan of the current administration. So I say we have seen a lot of Trump threatening or putting it on for a day and then pulling the tariff back and kind of going back and forth like that. So I guess I would be of the mindset that if we start seeing now, Smoot Hawley was on the order of like 40%, I want to say. So 20 to 25%, maybe not. But if we start seeing long-term tariffs and especially retaliatory tariffs from those other countries, I don't see how we don't find ourselves in a recession. And I take your point that maybe the stock market's not the best way to look at it, but that's what we use,
Well, it's certainly an indicator. Absolutely. Recessions generally are not great, right? But it's one of those, as an entrepreneur, I tend to look at it a little bit differently, right? There's a lot of opportunity that comes along with recessions. Average person I know is not going to look at it that way, which I think is unfortunate. I think people are taught incorrectly. But as far as whether I think we're pushing towards one, if we use the indicator like the stock market and we kind of see the fear of the people being driven that way, I think we would probably go at least into a minor one.
I'm trying to think through. Okay, so if we don't use the stock market, we talked a lot about, unemployment during the Great Depression and things like that. We would have to see people stop buying a product because it's so expensive, and then that industry suffering because no one's buying their product to start seeing layoffs, I think.
There's the consumer price index. That's also an indicator of overall just how expensive things are getting. And we just know from the basic human condition that nobody enjoys it when something gets more expensive. That's just kind of a rule of thumb. So if we see the consumer price index going up by more than inflation, then I think that's probably a good indicator as well. I would say that if these tariffs last beyond 6 months, then we're definitely in recession territory. If, on the other hand, as you alluded to, Will, Trump had kind of like thrown out, we're going to do this tariff, and then he pulled it back a couple of days later, and he's kind of played that a couple of times. If these current tariffs that we've been talking about are pulled back in the next few months, I think there will be a very short-term sort of minor blip, but I don't think it would be enough to call it a recession. I don't think that it would be like a 2-quarter plus kind of effect on our economy. So, and maybe that is, maybe he's not playing 3D chess, but maybe he does at least have a plan forward of, in his mind, these are not long-term tariffs. Maybe they're only intended to last for a couple of months just to bring these guys to the negotiation table or something. I don't know. Or maybe it's just I've got big alpha energy, so I'm going to do this. And then when it's made its message, then I will just take it back.
And that is kind of, I tend to agree that surely at some point as the economy's tanking, Trump says, okay, fine, these tariffs are off the table. I'm just left like, then what was the point? What did we achieve by it? What was the objective to begin with, other than making people bend the knee?
And sometimes that's the risk with business, right? You go into a negotiating position. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, right? There's no guarantees with that, but that's one of the inherent risks that you have playing that game. You hope it works, but there's no guarantees of it. But sometimes you got to try something.
But you go into it to achieve something. You don't just, go in willy-nilly and be like, I hope this works. Because but even if it does work, what are we doing this for? What is the point? I struggle a lot with that. Like, I just don't, while I know that most people are just going to watch the prices and that's all they're going to care about, if I knew what the objective was, when the car that I'm about to go buy is 20% more expensive, if I knew why we were doing this, then I wouldn't have to be the stereotypical Democrat that just hates everything that Trump does.
Are you going to buy a Tesla?
No. But I did see.
Even if you do, though, you can just dental floss the logo off, right?
But I did see, a meme came out within the last couple of days that was comparing how much of the Tesla was produced domestically versus other car manufacturers. And it said Tesla was at 100% produced in-house. And I was like, bullshit. So I went and Googled it. And I will admit, Tesla is one of, if not the best percentage of their vehicles are produced in the United States. It's at like 80. It depends on which, if it's the Model S, the Cybertruck, whatever, but on the order of like high 80s, 85% of the vehicle is produced in the United States compared with other brands that are lower than that. No, I'm not going to get a Tesla, but I do applaud them for producing it in-house. And I can only imagine that the 15% that they don't produce are those chips from Taiwan, like.
All right. Well, we are getting to that time where we actually might end this thing in a reasonable amount of time instead of going way long like we have the past couple of times. So I think maybe I'll get started with what's been making me happy this week, and then I'll pass it on to Will, and then Brett, you'll close us out. So, all right, I gotta grab this over here. So, for those of you who can't see because you're listening, I am holding up the Lego Hogwarts Castle. And this is what's been making me happy. Some families do like a family puzzle. Our family built this over the past week or so, and it's pretty amazing in the detail. It's got like these little chambers and things in there that show like different scenes from the movies and stuff. So it's amazing. We had a lot of fun. I got it on sale, and I was like, all right, we're going to do this as a family instead of doing a puzzle. And it was great. We loved it.
I thought it is pretty like detailed too. That's pretty good. I thought it was a 3D puzzle at first until you like brought it closer to the camera. All right. So for me, Dion, you'd mentioned earlier that you had finished up your taxes. This is not, I don't know. The fact that I'm using this is something that makes me happy. Like I almost didn't have to owe the government, which makes me happy compared to previous years where I have owed quite a bit. I'm not quite finished, but it looks to be quite a bit better than previous years. But it is, usually I do tend to have some libertarian tendencies around April of every year. But, I get over it when, I don't know, my house burns down and the fire department shows up.
I think that more people would be libertarian if instead of there being a withholding every paycheck so that you pay piecemeal throughout the year, if like on April 15th, you had to cut the entire check, I think most people would look at that and go, whoa, what are we paying for here?
That's a valid, just psychologically, yeah, that's a valid point. If I had to cut a check that big every April, but the government would not function because no one would have that much money.
I think we're losing you, Will.
Yeah,
and there he goes.
Yeah, well, while we're waiting for him to come back, Dion, I tend to agree with you when it comes to the taxes thing. That, yeah, the one lump sum, oh my gosh, people would have to budget for that. I think that'd be a big thing. But even if they had to just write a check every 2 weeks to send that in, rather than the auto deduction, right, where they had to physically do the work themselves to send the money in, I think that enough would be cause for people to start looking at, what are we paying for? What am I getting for this?
Yeah.
But it's that whole out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. But for me, what's been making me happy, got a chance to go to a daddy-daughter dance with two of my daughters this last week. It's just a fun thing. They had a glow theme. And so you got to come in, the whole black light event. The girls got these white shirts and they got to go and color them and draw all over them and just make fun designs. And of course, they go in there and they're doing ice cream bar and piñata and dance. And if they've got all the millennial music that I have no idea what's going on. So I get to be, the old guy dad for a few minutes that's in there, but just had a blast with my two daughters. They're 7 and 4, and they're just cutting loose, having fun. It's just kind of cool to watch them be kids, but I love the idea that I get to be the man in their life, right? That I get to be that example that they can see of how they should be treated and what they should expect from someone. I just love doing that. And so that was just a ton of fun for me. Really enjoyed it. But with that, guys, we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. We're actually under an hour on our mark tonight, so we'll keep it that way as we sign out. But thanks again for joining us. Please like, subscribe, share with your friends. We hope that we really do hope that our discussions lead to helping you make some decisions for yourself, right? We want to have our disagreements actually benefit the way that you think. Because that's just good. One of my favorite quotes is Henry Ford. He said, "Thinking is the hardest work a man can do. That's why so few engage in it." So I hope that we can help you to engage in some thinking and actually approach your world with a little bit more insight. But thanks for joining us here on the Leadership Podcast, and we'll see you guys next time.